So we're going to spend some time now discussing adaptive management, which many of you said is something that you want to understand better and be able to implement. So this image shows an adaptive management process, and it's really a cycle that allows us to identify what we want to achieve, how we want to achieve it, track our progress, learn, adjust our actions to improve based on our learning, and then go into a next cycle. So we're going to break these down. I know I just went through those really quickly, but it's this idea of a cycle that we're talking about. So we'll look at each of these stages. The first step is planning. And this is when we set out to establish a protected area. One of the first things we do is to identify our objectives. It's what are we trying to achieve? Why are we establishing this site in the first place? So once we know why we're doing it, what we want to achieve, we develop our specific actions or strategies that we know we want to implement to achieve it. So that's the planning step. Then we have this do or implement step. It's really what we're implementing the strategies that we set out to do in our plan. And we also think about how are we going to set up some type of monitoring to understand if we're achieving our success. So we plan, we implement the plan, and we figure out a way to understand if we are achieving our success. In monitoring, we're then gathering and reviewing information that tells us how we're doing toward implementing our actions and meeting our objectives. So we gather that data and we assess our effectiveness. And then we use that to learn. Based on our assessment, we see what we're doing well, and that's great. The things we're doing well, we want to keep doing. But then we also want to see what's not working well and why isn't working well, and what can we do better to help us get closer to those objectives. And then finally, based on that learning, we will adjust our strategies so that we have a better chance of success going into the next cycle. And it's really because of this adjustment phase that it's called adaptive management. We're adapting our management based on what we learn. And in addition to all of these steps that happen as part of managing your protected area, there's also things that take place outside of a protected area that need to be considered and thought of when we're going through this cycle. And we call this the local context in this course. And it includes things like laws and policies or socioeconomic conditions or environmental trends. These aren't necessarily things you can manage directly. You're not going to create new laws as a protected area manager, but they can influence how you manage the site. So they need to be considered throughout this cycle that you go through. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about how PAME assessments or protected area management effectiveness assessments can help us learn and adapt management. So PAME assessments like the one that you're going to be using in this course really help us explore in each step of this cycle more details about what's working and what needs improving. Yep. Okay, so for example, in the planning step, there are key components that should be considered to help you be successful. So this includes things like strong community engagement, a good management plan that's being used, and designing the site to achieve your desired objectives. All of these components, among other things, are really important when you're in the planning part of this adaptive management cycle. And similarly, there are other important components in each step of this cycle. So they're kind of like best practices in each step of the cycle that should be considered. And if you do consider them and kind of follow some guidance, you have a better chance of success. And these are the things that you're going to be assessing through this course. So we're going to talk a lot more about management effectiveness and specific components in each part of the cycle in the next few modules, but I just wanted to touch on it here and how it links to adaptive management. So PAME assessments that we'll do can help us adapt management in a few ways. First, it helps ensure that we're thinking about all of these important components that should be considered in each step of that cycle. They also can help us understand our strengths, our challenges, and where we might have gaps. And they help us improve in our decision making. So even if your protected area is making progress toward your objectives, assessing management effectiveness can help you answer, are we using our staff and our funding for the actions that are going to provide us the highest likelihood of achieving our objectives? Protected area management effectiveness. So what is protected area management effectiveness? Well, we know that protected areas are one of the most powerful tools available for conservation of natural environments and to support livelihoods that depend on them. But it's really only if they're achieving their ecological, socioeconomic, and cultural objectives. So simply put, an effectively managed protected area is one that's achieving the objectives that it was established for. But there are many sites that are achieving their objectives and many sites that are not, or only partially achieving their objectives. And that's because protected area objectives are complex to achieve. It's not simply that we can establish a site and walk away and that magically the objectives are going to appear, that we're going to be successful in achieving them. We really have to put in a lot of activities and actions that can help us achieve those specific objectives. And those have to be really tailored to the local situation and involve a variety of approaches that contribute to those objectives. So achieving objectives can be complex. So why do we ultimately create protected areas? You guys came up with pretty much all the ones that I would have said. Protected areas are usually established to improve marine and terrestrial environments and support local communities. So that includes everything from having healthy reef and forest ecosystems that provide then food security, livelihoods, medicines. They enable traditional practices, or they protect coastlines from storms. So that's ultimately the why we do this, the desired results, those ultimate objectives that we're trying to get from protected areas. But what if a protected area is not achieving those objectives? How do we know what to do differently, or what is helping us succeed if we are making progress? Achieving conservation and socioeconomic benefits, it's not as simple as establishing the site and then we get those results. We all know that there's a lot of other actions that you guys just mentioned that need to be taken, and that's what we're calling management. So let's explore some of the most important ones, and you guys covered most of them in your exercise you just did. But what are those important components or conditions that we believe must be in place to enable our protected area to achieve those objectives? To establish a protected area, there are some foundational things that we must understand or must be in place, or it's going to be extremely hard to do anything else. And these are things in the local context. things like authority to manage the area. If we don't have the authority to manage and we can't make decisions, we can't take actions. We can't even really do anything towards the site. So that's critical. Political will is also needed to establish laws and provide funding that can support management of the site. We need to have some understanding of the socioeconomic and ecological conditions, like what's happening in the community, how are people using the site, what's happening with the resources. We need to understand that to be able to move forward and take strategic management actions. And we also need some kind of organized group and funds to implement various activities. So these components of the local context of the adaptive management cycle provide the foundation for protected area management. Planning is another step of the adaptive management cycle, and some key activities in this step are community engagement. So you guys mentioned that, having community engagement and buy-in so that their interests are represented and they're help defining what's happening at the site and what outcomes they want to achieve. We also need to have those clear objectives so that we're designing the site making it the right shape and the right size or the right area so that's able to achieve those objectives. And then we need to have a good management plan. We need to have clear strategies on how we're going to address threats to the site and how we're going to achieve the objectives. That includes having staff that are trained to implement those activities. And this step provides us with a clear direction of what to do. We can then move into implementation and monitoring step of adaptive management. As we implement our plan, it's important that we keep the community engaged in management to support the protected area so they comply with rules. This is also when we implement the strategies to reduce any threats that might be degrading the resources we're trying to protect that we outlined in our plan. So we might have to address things like pollution or poaching or clearing. And if these are not addressed, it'd be hard to improve the health of our resources. We also need active compliance and enforcement efforts, such as outreach to encourage people to understand why the rules are in place and so there are consequences when there are violations. And then finally, we need to monitor things. What's working, what's not? Are we moving closer to our objectives that we want to see? So all of these you see on the slide that happen over time, they're related to each other. And these are some of the most important components that help you achieve those ultimate objectives and community benefits. And so you see successful MPAs can be complex. It's not just that establishment. There's all of these other things that we have to think of to make them successful. And all of these components are also what we're referring to when we say management effectiveness. It means we're not just looking if the site was established, but we're assessing all of these critical components that we know are important for success. And from the local context, like political will, all the way through to how we're doing with our planning, to how we're doing with implementing things like threat reduction, to are we monitoring, are we tracking what's working, what's not, are we seeing trends in the resources and making sure that that's part of our daily management. And if we're doing all of these things well and all of these components are in place, we're more likely going to be able to achieve the objectives we set out to and improve resource health and receive those community benefits. That is why we established protected areas in the first place. And these are the things that you're going to be assessing in this course. And by assessing the management effectiveness, what we're going to be doing these next few modules, we're not just looking at, are we meeting these ultimate objectives, but why or why not? Do we have these important components in place? Maybe we did them a while back and we haven't thought of them in a long time, but we need to rethink about some of these things and improve upon them. And that will help us then and get us closer to those objectives. And using all of this knowledge that we will go through as you assess these different components, you then can adjust your management actions to say, you know what, we've got this component, we're doing community engagement really well, for example. We've been out there a lot, we have really good relationships, but what's not working is we haven't had any monitoring set up. We haven't been tracking what's going on. So that's something that we might want to adjust. So we'll be learning from all of that assessment, all of these discussions you have for all of these components, and be able to then adapt your management and update your plan. So hopefully you recognize that the adaptive management cycle that we reviewed in Module 1 is providing the headers for all of these various columns, because it's basically, this is the different components within that adaptive management cycle that we're going to be assessing. Next, we're going to talk about protected area management effectiveness globally and regionally. So management effectiveness has also gotten attention in the global community. As protected areas have increasingly been established around the world, there's been a recognition that we need to focus on effectiveness of the protected areas rather than simply just establishment. So rather than just what percent area is in protected area status, we're looking at, are they working and why or why not? So, for example, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, Target 3, is to ensure that at least 30% globally of land areas and sea areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and its contributions to people, are conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative, and well-connected systems of protected areas. So this is a target that Palau, FSM, and RMI have all committed to. Your countries have committed to this global commitment, and your governments commit to these so that they can access funding to support conservation efforts. So this target is something that governments are going to need to report on soon. They're going to need to start reporting on management effectiveness, not just the percent area under protection, but are they working? So I've been in touch with folks who are working on what that looks like. What does that mean that every country has to report on management effectiveness? And what they've assured me is that local tools will be able to be used. So it's not that there's going to be one specific tool that has to be used. They're creating a framework that will allow local tools to be used. So the MET tool that we're using in this course will help you to be able to report out on these global commitments and help your national governments be able to say, are our areas being effectively managed or not? Additionally, at the regional level, there's the Micronesia Challenge, which also includes management effectiveness. So in 2006, I know a lot of you know this, but there are some newer folks that haven't been as familiar with the Micronesia Challenge. But in 2006, the governments of the FSM, Guam, Marshalls, the Marianas, and Palau agreed to effectively conserve at least 30% of nearshore resources and 20% of terrestrial resources by 2020. And then in 2019, the executive leaders recommitted and expanded the MC with an emphasis on effective management. So the new target is to effectively manage at least 50% of marine resources and 30% of terrestrial resources across Micronesia. What I want to make clear, though, is that this 50% of effective management does not mean the intent behind this is not about 50% of the marine area placed into protected areas. So they're still maintaining that it's 30% in protected areas, but the additional 20% will be more focused on fisheries management and other measures. But it is about effectively managing that 30% of protected areas. And the MC has helped leverage funding into the region. So this is another important commitment that's happened regionally. So let's just look at some of the progress from the MC 2020, the target of 30% marine areas effectively conserved, and how that relates to what we're talking about. So 78% of marine protected areas were monitored over time to see if they were effectively conserved, which was defined generally as having healthy coral cover, diversity, and abundance. So that was the target, was to have those things: healthy coral cover, diversity, and abundance. And there was a huge monitoring effort around the region. And the results of that monitoring showed that less than half of those sites were achieving that objective. So less than half were having healthy coral cover, improved diversity, and abundance. So what that MC monitoring did really well was to measure the progress of those long-term objectives. Are we improving the health of the resources, having improved reefs, increased target fish populations? And it was an incredibly impressive monitoring effort that is very rare globally. So I want to express how unique and valuable that monitoring data set is. And there also have been some challenges. First, because there were no regular assessments of management effectiveness. So we don't know why half of the sites are not improving and achieving their objective. We don't know what's going on at those sites. We haven't looked at all of these other components of management effectiveness. So we can't say, well, we should change this so we can maybe do better at meeting those objectives. We really are not clear at what's going on in those sites. So there wasn't any monitoring of management effectiveness. And secondly, the monitoring outcomes like these long-term impacts like coral cover and biodiversity, and even community perceptions, they often take more robust monitoring methods like field assessments and household surveys, and they require longer periods of time to change. It's not easy to improve the health of coral reefs quickly or change community perception quickly necessarily. So if we're just assessing those things that take a long time, we're missing out on showing progress of all of these other things that can move us toward those objectives. Like, do we have good plans in place? Are we engaging the community? Do we have effective compliance and enforcement programs? So we don't have those kind of shorter term measures of progress that we're able to show. So again, this is what the gap we're trying to fill by assessing management effectiveness is. So we can say, okay, if we've looked at the site, and I mean, Kostra, you guys mentioned it in the beginning, that your biological monitoring is showing that, things are not changing there. There's not improvement. So this kind of assessment can help understand maybe why or why not those things are not changing. And that's what we'll be doing with the MET tool. We'll be exploring these different components and breaking them down to really think about, what could be improved upon. Liz Turk is going to now share with us how the One community and Chuk use these design principles and local knowledge to develop their locally managed area that used different types of zones and rules. So I'm going to hand it over to Liz.
So I'm going to talk today about designing marine protected areas to achieve community objectives. And we're going to use the municipality of Oneisomw and Chuk in the Federated States of Micronesia as an example. We chose One because we were able to use the latest science along with community knowledge to design the marine protected area network to achieve what the community wanted. But also then when they realized that maybe the marine protected area wasn't the only tool in their toolbox, they adopted other management strategies to fill the gaps. So real quick, since we don't actually have participants from Chuk on this call, Oneisomw is a municipality made up of 6 villages in Chuk, which is in the western part of Chuk Lagoon. In the Federated States of Micronesia. About 500 or so people live there. And because they are so far from the main island of Wena, there's not a lot of opportunities for employment. So they are very dependent on fishing and their other natural resources for day-to-day livelihoods. So more than 10 years ago, the mayor of One approached TNC, Chuk Conservation Society, and the Chuk Department of Marine Resources about concerns he and his community was seeing about the health of their resources. And he also wanted just a plan to help him govern his community or his municipality. And they listed concerns around things like fewer fish, changes in weather patterns, issues with their school and dispensary, and also coastal and land-based erosion. And so using this process, we used the conservation action planning integrated with the local early action planning tool to address climate change threats. And what came out of this was that they were, their primary concern was around fisheries. So as we know, marine protected areas, if designed correctly and are well implemented, they can achieve multiple objectives like protecting biodiversity, climate change adaptation, fisheries management, and/or tourism management. A lot of protected areas across Micronesia in the past were really designed around achieving or protecting biodiversity. And that was because at the time that a lot of our older marine protected areas were developed, those were the information and tools we had. But we were very fortunate when we started the process in One that there was just a lot of new tools had just come out, in particularly around how to use the latest science along with community knowledge to better design marine protected areas to achieve to achieve communities' results. And so we were able to do this in One. So I'm not going to go back into detail because Megan just has gone over some of these already. It's not changing. Yeah? Not yet. Oh, there we go. All right. So we have these 9 essential factors that must be considered to keep resources abundant and resilient. And so we took these into consideration in the planning process in Oneisomw. So we spend a lot of time with the community and stakeholders reviewing what these different essential factors mean and what that means in terms of marine protected area design. And so several of these were actually kind of adopted as what we could call the principles of design for our marine spatial plan. And so as we came up with different ways we could place protected areas, we made sure that they were including things like different types of habitat or multiple representations of habitat. And then we were able to think about size and how far the fish that One wanted to protect. So now I'm going to jump in a little bit to some of the different information we had available and were able to consider in this. So the first thing you're looking at here is a heat map of fishing pressure. So if you look over by One, you can see that their outer reef is dark orange, which means there was a lot of fishing going on their outer reefs. And then we were able to talk with the community in One to find out what was going on. And they said that mostly on a day-to-day basis, they were not fishing on the outer reefs. That's where they were doing a lot of the commercial fishing. So not the day-to-day subsistence fishing. Also really fortunate to have a lot of data from the Micronesia Challenge monitoring program, which I know a lot of you have access to as well. And so, as well as from 2 rapid ecological assessments that were done in Chuk Lagoon. And so this was able to tell us about the health of the habitat around One, including both coral reefs and the different types of corals found there, as well as the biomass of fish. And for example, this map is showing us the ratio of large to small fish around the reefs in One. We also had a recent fish market survey had just been completed for Chuk. And so we had this fisheries dependent data. So we had information about daily commercial landings, hatch compositions, and fishers interviews. And what we learned was, so this data was mostly based on what was fish being brought and sold on the main island of Weta in Chuk. And so we found that most of the fish being sold were not coming from One. So we knew that the fish from One were not making up a large amount of commercial fish in Chuk Lagoon. At the same time, based on these this data collected, fisheries management recommendations were made for Chuk, and several of these were adopted as state and put into place as state regulations. And this is important for Chuk because although Chuk Department of Marine Resources has a mandate to enforce these regulations, reefs in Chuk are individually owned. So it was very important that reef owners knew about these regulations, and then they could decide if they were going to enforce these regulations on their reefs. And then most importantly, we have community knowledge. So we're able to look at all of that data we had and get the story behind it from the people of Oneisomw. Is this what they were really seeing? Is it true that they weren't selling a lot of their fish in Wena, or was that not true? So we were able to go through all of that and confirm. Also, as Megan talked about, we really wanted to make sure that we were including the whole community in a lot of the different decisions we were making. So as you can see that picture in the middle, everybody in the community got a chance to vote for the fish species that they were interested in or concerned about or wanted to see better management for or wanted to see more of. And you can see from the picture on the right, we also made sure that we had the youth participate. So we had children who participated and got to vote. We had women, we had fishers, we had farmers, we had traditional leadership, as well as the leadership of the community. So a lot of the different things, like when we were developing objectives, we used stickers so that people could vote on what were the things they were most concerned about. So once the Oneisomw had prioritized the fish species that they were most interested in, we went back through, and this is just a table that shows the different habitat needs, spawning needs of the different fish species, and even invertebrates they're concerned of. And so we wanted to take all of that information into account when we were designing the protected area. So are the parrotfish species that Oneisomw wants to protect, is there habitat needs protected? Do we know when they're spawning? Do they spawn in a particular location, or is it monthly? What do we need to do? Also, their movement patterns. So Megan talked about how the home ranges of fish species, are those home ranges protected in the protected area that we are designing? So we went back and forth in One. We looked at, like I said, all that different information. We drew all different types of designs on the protected area, not on the protected area, on the map. And in the end, we had the Oneisomw Resource Management Committee. This is what they proposed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. So first, you see that large red area, number 5. This is a no-take zone. And as you can, the largest no-take zone is, as you can see, it goes all the way out, all the way from the nearshore waters, all the way out to the outer reefs. And it includes seagrass and mangrove habitat, as well as different types of reefs and the channel. And this is also protecting one of the areas that we saw was receiving a lot of fishing, especially commercial-based fishing. And also, as you see, it's connecting the different habitats. So fish species that need to travel or in their life history from different habitats are protected. Then you see around closer to One is 4 smaller protected areas. And as we know, smaller protected areas might not protect some of these larger, slow growing fish that have large home ranges. But these smaller areas were designed to protect those smaller, fast growing fish that the people of One had said are what they're mostly targeting in that area. So mostly near shore, they're doing subsistence fishing and they're catching things like rabbit fish and that sort of thing for their daily consumption. The last area that I want to point out is in orange, and this is their near shore managed area. And so they did not go for a full no take. What they said is that that area is only for subsistence fishing and only for residents of One. And so they said there's no need there, and most of their commercial fishing is not done there anyways. So they want to continue to do their daily fishing there. But they want to make sure that it's managed and no commercial fishing. And they also just realized we talked about different fishing methods, and they also decided that no nighttime spearfishing could take place in that near shore area. Since they didn't need to be collecting tons of fish, they're only collecting what they need on a daily basis. After reviewing the proposed protected area networks and looking at the key species that the people of One wanted to protect or manage, they decided to adopt some additional management measures. So like I said, at this time, Chuk had just adopted statewide fishing regulations. And so we reviewed those and the communities decided which ones they wanted to prioritize. And then if there were any others they wanted to adopt. So a few of the things that I wanted to point out was around the commercial fishing ban. They wanted to say that nobody who is not from One, so only residents of Oneisomw are allowed to do commercial fishing in their waters. And that might be harder to implement on other islands where the reef or land tenure is different. But like I said, in Oneisomw, because the reefs are privately owned, all of the reef owners could agree to this. Another one is that the grouper seasonal ban, they were really interested in enforcing this because there is a very large grouper spawning aggregation that is not in One's waters, but the groupers travel through One's waters to get them. And you can see them kind of lined up on their way there. So they wanted to protect that area because otherwise people could just sit on top of this line of groupers and catch them. Then of course they looked at some of the species that might not be protected due to the size of their marine protected areas. And so that included some of the slow growing and slow to mature species like bumphead parrotfish and Napoleon wrasse. In the end, they have some proposed size limits that they said they would put in place with what is in line with the Chuk regulations, but we didn't in the end finalize those recommendations because they decided that those might be harder to enforce in their waters. And so that wasn't a priority that they chose. So all in all, this then became what Oneisomw adopted as their fisheries management plan, which includes both those protected areas as well as these fisheries management regulations. So